All right, also part of the central nervous system is the spinal cord. So we went through the brain. The spinal cord right here begins at the foramen magnum. Remember that hole in the occipital lobe called the foramen magnum? That's where the spinal cord begins. So basically you have the medulla oblongata, the most inferior part of the brainstem, and then inferior to that we have spinal cord. And spinal cord runs all the way down to right about here. That's where it ends. So around L1 or L2 lumbar vertebrae, you have all these nerves hanging down from the spinal cord, right? But the spinal cord actually ends at L1 or L2. Its function, well, it's two-way communication, meaning all your sensory information goes up the spinal cord to the brain, and your motor information travels down the spinal cord out, right, towards the body. And that's what we mean by two-way communication, and we'll look at reflexes a little bit later. Let's go to the next slide. All right, a couple good labels here. This conus medullaris that you see right there, conus medullaris, is this little cone area right there, which is the termination of the spinal cord. So that's the inferior tip at L1 or L2 of the spinal cord. We call that conus medullaris, and then it's anchored down to the coccyx. So you see that green ligament? It's a green ligament that's kind of tied onto the conus medullaris and anchored onto the coccyx bone. That's the filum terminale, and that's what kind of anchors the spinal cord down, so it just doesn't kind of flop around in there. It's just tied tightly down to the coccyx bone. Don't need denticulate ligaments. Now, what's on this slide is not part of the central nervous system. So this is mainly for part 2 of chapter 13, but I'm just going to introduce it here since we're talking about the spinal cord. You can see coming out of the spinal cord, actually going in and going out of the spinal cord, all of these little roots, right? We call these spinal nerves. 31 pairs of spinal nerves, right, named according to the vertebrae they come in and out of. Remember, when we see the word nerves, that's peripheral nervous system, spinal nerves, cranial nerves. So that's how we know we're not in the central nervous system anymore, but we just want to introduce it here. Yeah, the spinal nerves are these wires that you see entering and leaving the spinal cord on either side. The cauda equina is a collection of nerves. Remember we said the spinal cord ends right here at the conus medullaris, and all these nerves, not the green filum terminale, but all these yellow nerves that are hanging down, well, these are nerves. So if it's nerves, this is the peripheral nervous system. So we call these nerves that hang down from the cauda equina, from the conus medullaris, we call it the cauda equina, which means horse's tail. Equina is horse, cauda is tail, and I guess it kind of looks like a horse's tail that hangs down from the conus medullaris. Now let's look at a cross section of the spinal cord, and let's take this spinal cord and make it a little larger so we can see it right here. Well, there's two grooves. On the anterior side, we have an anterior or ventral median fissure. And there it is right here, ventral or anterior median fissure. It's a real deep groove. Look how wide it is. And then we go to the posterior end, and it's a long but very shallow, right, or I should say very narrow type of groove. That's called the dorsal or posterior median sulcus. So you have an anterior median fissure, posterior median sulcus dividing left and right parts of the spinal cord. In the spinal cord, you can see gray matter in the interior, kind of shaped like a letter H, with the white matter all the way around it. So we have a connection between left and right spinal cord, the gray matter right here. So that area, there's a number 3 there, that area is called the gray commissure, which connects the left and right spinal cord together. And right in the center, labeled number 10, that's your central canal. It doesn't say it here, but you'll see that somewhere else. Central canal is just a canal going through the spinal cord where fluid flows through, cerebrospinal fluid, which we'll see a little later in this PowerPoint. All right, a lot more to label on the spinal cord cross section here. So the gray matter is split up into horns. So you have dorsal horns on each side. Dorsal horns, they're receiving sensory information, so information's actually entering through the dorsal horns from all parts of the body. And then you have anterior or ventral horns, that's motor output that's going to leave the spinal cord and go out to muscles and glands. So you have the dorsal horns for sensory, the motor horns for motor, and then sometimes you'll see it's labeled right here, and you can see it right there too. There's a lateral horn. It's much smaller. Lateral horn has to do with the sympathetic nervous system, which is your fight or flight nervous system, which is the last chapter we do in this course. So we'll kind of look at that a little more later in the course. Those are the horns. Then we have, I'm thinking of something, but I guess it's on the next slide, so I'll just cover what's on this slide now. Roots. We have dorsal root right through here. So the dorsal root is the sensory information going into the spinal cord, so into the dorsal horn. So that's dorsal root and dorsal horn. The dorsal root has just a whole cluster of cell bodies of the neurons right here. And we know that in the peripheral nervous system, we call a cluster of cell bodies a ganglia. Right? So this little bump is a dorsal root ganglia right here. There's the dorsal root into the dorsal horn. And on the motor side, we have the ventral horn that goes, information flows from the ventral horn to the ventral root. So the ventral root, remember, is motor. Dorsal side is sensory. So we have kind of this one-way, right, or two-way, where the sensory is on the posterior side, motor is on the anterior side. But kind of the point of this slide here is, yeah, the gray matter, these are called roots. And then are called horns. The gray matter is called horns, and the roots are these nerves, peripheral nervous system now, right, that is entering and leaving the spinal cord. So this is just a nice visual. We can see different levels. Remember the spinal nerves that we labeled earlier, coming in and out of the spinal cord. And now we can see, there's your gray matter, the horns, dorsal horn, lateral horn, ventral horn. There's your dorsal root ganglion, ventral root. So just another look at what we've seen so far. All right, we could get a little more specific with this slide over here. We said that the roots when we're in the ventral root, that has to do with motor activity. When we're in the dorsal root, that's sensory activity. Well, we can split it up into somatic sensory and visceral sensory, somatic motor and visceral motor. So you're not going to be asked to label those specific areas there, but you should know what they mean. Somatic motor, remember your somatic nervous system from the previous chapter. Somatic motor means motor to skeletal muscle. So this is voluntary motor. Where visceral motor, that's motor to smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. So this is your autonomic or involuntary nervous system. So that's the difference in the motor division. When we get to sensory, well, somatic sensory, this is sensory information coming in from things typically that we're aware of, like from the receptors in your skin, like touch, pressure, temperature, and also from your special senses, like vision, sight, hearing, smell, right? That's all somatic sensory. Well, visceral sensory, that's sensory information coming in from your visceral organs, like from your stomach or from your bladder, those types of things. Now, what we haven't mentioned yet is the white matter. They have all these different colors on them, blue and reds here, but this is all white matter. We're not in the letter H. That's not the gray matter. It's not the horns. The white matter we separate into columns. So you have dorsal columns on the left and on the right. You have ventral columns on the left and on the right. And then you have lateral columns on the left and on the right. So remember, gray matter is divided up into horns. White matter is divided up into columns. Do you recall in the gray matter where anterior or ventral is motor, posterior or dorsal is sensory? Well, with the white matter, it's really all over the place. You can see descending tracts in red, that's motor. Ascending tracts in blue, that's sensory. Yeah, posterior or dorsal columns is all sensory, is all ascending tracts. Ascending meaning going up towards the brain, so that's sensory. Where the anterior columns and lateral columns are both ascending and descending, red and blue. So there's not as much organization, I guess we can say, in the white matter as there was in the gray matter, where it was split between dorsal and ventral. So all of these different tracts or columns that I have here, don't worry about. That's never come up on any test. Basically, the point here is that the gray matter is divided in horns and the white matter is divided up into these three types of columns.